Thank you. Oh, I hope I'm moving forward. There we go. This whole piece of work had its genesis really in 2009 when we were in Singapore, when Guy and Ron and I sat down and said, what the heck are we going to do with these new graduate attributes, and can we possibly get useful stuff out of all of the work that we've already done related to CDIO? And part of our idea was we already have pretty good programs. We ought to be able to meet our accreditation looking at the things that we already do rather than having to go back and change our programs. And we presented this work last year. That was one of the evolving levels of the syllabus. This is an update on what we presented last year. So for those of you who saw last year's version, this is much the same stuff. World trend to come up with definitions for competencies and do better accounting of what we're actually teaching students. These are the new ones in Canada, which we've already seen here. Likewise, in other places, they all tend to descend from the Washington Accord, where everybody, more or less, got together and agreed on what we're looking for in engineers. One of the things that we see in CDIO and elsewhere is we have a remarkable agreement. Our students, our faculty, ourselves, industry partners, we all have a good agreement on what really ought to be there in an engineering education. The question is, how do we quantify that and account for it? So the map that we set out to build, we looked at the 12 CEAB attributes, and they're really quite broad. It's very difficult to look at those attributes and go back and say, we teach this attribute. What we teach is really down at a much grittier level when we get down to much smaller, more detailed chunks outcomes. So we can't really say that attribute X, a student who has communication, can meet a particular learning outcome. But we can say that if we've got some detailed outcomes, a collection of those outcomes is sufficient to say this student's able to communicate. So we can go from the detail level up to the higher level in our process of justification, our process of accreditation. We can't easily go from the general level down to the detail level without doing a lot more work. So some of these syllabus items or learning outcomes are in the must-have category. You'll see them in red in the later charts. Others are in the contributory category, things that if you take a handful of them together certainly enhance your ability to demonstrate that you've got the attributes that we're looking for in graduates, but are not necessarily something that every graduate must have from every program in every accreditable engineering school in Canada or elsewhere. And also, some of them make big contributions and some of them make small contributions. Don't get hung up on the fact that, like an engineer, I've put numbers on things. We've only used 3 different numbers, 0.25, 0.5, and 1.0. So here's the big picture for your dean. You can't do very much useful with this picture if you're actually trying to analyze your curriculum. But what it does give you is a sense that CEAB attributes across the top and CDIO attributes down the side here, they do map together, and there does seem to be sort of a correlation in red that we've even put them in about the same order. So if you were a social scientist looking at this drawing, I can put a regression line sort of right down here and conclude that these things are strongly correlated. But you don't get much farther with that kind of a picture. If you're actually going to do some work on your curriculum, you need this picture. And I don't think you can read that because I can't read that, but it gives you a sense of the overall map that these must-haves tend to clump in places. Here and here, some up there. So that in general, between CEAB and CDIO, we've tended to group these capabilities together. There's some variations on that, but this gives you some idea of the topography at the 3rd level. And even at the 3rd level, we're still not down to outcomes yet. We're not down to things that we can actually assess a student's ability to do a particular task in these some 100 or so different categories. It's only when we get to about the 400 or so outcome level topics at the 4th level in CDIO that we start to get into things that we can actually measure students' ability to complete.
Rick, when you
Yes.
say must have, you mean as in this item on the left side must be present in order to satisfy the item at the top?
Yes, I'm saying the forward mapping up here, lifelong learning, the ones in red here are the ones that you must have some evidence from the CDIO elements identified in this list in order to meet the lifelong learning attribute. Yeah. So some of the matches are really simple. 1, 2, and 3 to 1, 2, and 3 between the two of them. Very close. Teaming and communication line up. The groupings are almost identical. It's 1-for-1 mapping. So fairly straightforward. Some represent different arrangements of the same material. We see the same things in both of them, but they're spread out in different ways. So, for example, the CEAB graduate attribute design, being CDIO with a big D in it, we spread them out over a wider variety of our 2nd level topics. On the other hand, we've grouped ethics, equity, and other responsibilities together into one particular line, and we've, in CEAB, that's spread out over a wider variety of graduate attributes. So it's not that there's different stuff in CEAB and CDIO so much as we've just spread them out in different ways. The topics are very similar. And in some cases, there's explicit content in one where the content's implicit lower level in the other. So for instance, system thinking and attitudes, thoughts, and learning, whoops, I got ahead of myself. The system thinking stuff is explicit in CDIO, but not in CEAB. CEAB is explicit about economics and project management at the attribute level, whereas it's tucked into a variety of levels in the CDIO. So again, not necessarily differences in program, but differences in organization of these descriptions. So the main conclusion here is that CDIO is really a superset of the CEAB requirements for graduate attributes. You can get a collection of CDIO syllabus topic items, particularly if you go down to the 4th level, come up with a collection which will meet all of the CEAB graduate attributes. And it's not necessarily going to be the collection that meets the CEAB graduate attributes. I'll have one collection at Queen's in Kingston. Bob and Ron will have something else out in Calgary, and that's not that one program's better than the other or that one program meets the attributes better than the other. It's two different flavors of mechanical engineering, which gives us two equally good programs that equally but differently meet those attribute requirements. So there are going to be many different ways to meet both CDIO and CEAB requirements. Not a one-size-fits-all sort of, you must have all of the same things and we're all going to be cookie-cutter molds. So this mapping gives you a starting point, and you can add and remove things, but it gives you some evidence that you can use to show that you meet the mapping. And that brings me to the conclusion of the first part, the part I was looking for as the mapping paper. And now we're going to try and see if we can move forwards and take the mapping and turn it around. Something useful, if we know we need some outcomes to satisfy some attributes, where can we go and find those in our existing curriculum rather than creating new curriculum in response to CEAB? So I'd be happy to take any questions on this part now before we get into the workshop.
I just have a...
Sure.
You were talking about how the graduate attributes are very general and they really need to be refined. With some of the mapping, do you think there's some interpretation in the mapping of what you think the CEAB means by that graduate attribute? Or?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the attributes in the published documentation from CEAB are really quite vague, and we're all sitting around tables, I'm sure at Calgary as well as at Queen's and elsewhere, arguing about what really goes into this attribute. And the process, as it seems to be unfolding, is that the universities will be doing a lot of the definition of what is in these attributes, and that those who are visited first and are speaking most loudly will go a long way in shaping the CEAB's perception of what their attributes actually mean. So I think when we go through the first rounds of the new process, it's going to be important to have an exchange in both directions to establish and share what these attributes actually mean. Yes?
You mentioned things like economics and project management. Economics, for sure, it's explicitly mentioned in the Engineers Canada document. Why take a blended approach? Like, why not, instead of saying, you got to map everything back and forth with CDIO. Why not say, well, 90% of it we can map with CDIO and 10% we're just not going to?
Well, as Ed was saying in the previous presentation, I don't know if you were here for that, one of the things we'd like to say is that CDIO does have a complete coverage of what we're expecting to see in engineering education worldwide. And that in the previous curriculum documentation on the syllabus for CDIO, there was certainly by implication finance and economic and project management. However, it appeared in the syllabus at a level 3 or a level 4, which when you took that big picture slide for the dean, the one that had the 19 down the and 12 across the top, it looked invisible. In fact, it was there, and the rearrangement into syllabus version 2.0 makes that visible at the level of the decision makers rather than at the level of those of us who are having to implement it down in the program.
At Queen's, is there uniform agreement to use the CDIO mapping towards accreditation?
We're working on that. We're using a little bit of a stealth approach, that the work that we've been doing in reforming our curriculum the last couple of years looks an awful lot like CDIO, and we are implementing CDIO standards at the faculty level. However, there's a perception among some departments that CDIO is a mechanical engineering thing. And as a result, we're not pushing too hard as yet to use the CDIO terminology. But were you at the meeting where Brian was talking? I understand he's using CDIO in public a little bit more, even in non-CDIO venues. So we're following the approaches. We're not using the branding quite as strongly as we might in order to sneak up on people a little. Other questions? Okay, well, moving on to the workshop segment. Our objective and the main reason for doing this was to try to win the accreditation game using CDIO. And what does it mean to win? Well, the biggest, most important win is to have an accredited program going forward. That's what we all need in order to continue to get our funding, to continue to attract our students. Losing accreditation is not an option, but passing is enough to win. If you can keep on running your program and keep graduating students who get registered with the professional associations, you've won. And getting the maximum term is even better because it means you don't have to do it again in 3 years, you can do it in 6. And so, given that we're going to win, because losing's not an option. What we'd like to do is minimize the work and the disruption to our program in achieving this win, and conserve program resources, because program resources are getting tight everywhere. So challenges in getting accreditation, you've got to have adequate resources. That's not something CDIO can help you with very much. You've got to fight this fight with your dean and your pro and board of governors and possibly your provincial or state governments. What CDIO can help you with is showing that you've got adequate curriculum. You've got the subject content, you've got the hands-on type activities, and that you're meeting the student outcomes that are required by your accreditation process. And this is where I'm going to focus today in the workshop.